All right, it looks like we're at 6:30 now, so hello everyone and welcome to the second night of the 2020 Women in Clean Energy Conference. We are so excited to have you here today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Katie Van Horn. I'm a 2018 grad of the University of Dayton, helped to start this conference as a way to give back. I graduated in mechanical engineering and now work at ICF as a distributed grid strategy analyst. And I am so excited to host this session today and moderate it as well. It's no secret that women tend to be underrepresented across the energy field. And this conference was founded on the idea that we could get women to the table not only in the energy industry, but in the fight against climate change by providing the resources, knowledge, and connections necessary to build impactful careers in the clean energy field. So with that being said, we encourage you all today to ask questions. You'll be able to ask questions throughout the session via the chat box, and they will all be addressed at the end. And we will also be providing contact information for not only all of our speakers here today during this session, but all of the speakers speaking in the other sessions as well if you're unable to attend. And we really encourage you to follow up, forge those connections, and make sure that you're really getting to know others in the industry through this event as well. As we move forward, please be aware that we will be recording today's session, and the recording will be posted on the website, and that includes the Q&A session. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and introduce today's session in particular. So today's session is focusing on regulation and policy. So this includes not only government bodies and the legislative landscape across the country, but it also includes considerations for utilities and transmission organizations as they plan and create policies that facilitate clean energy adoption. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first speaker, Madalyn Beban. Madalyn joins us from PJM Interconnection, where she serves as a rotation engineer. So please join me in welcoming Madalyn.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. Hopefully you all can hear me. I'm going to take this as a yes. I'm going to take over control and get my presentation kicked off. First and foremost, oh, I'm going to go back. Spoiler alert. I'm glad this is recorded. But hello, my name is Madalyn Beban. I am also a University of Dayton 2018 graduate from the mechanical engineering program. I am currently an engineer with PJM Interconnection in their rotational program. And I'm here today to give you two things. First and foremost, a primer on my professional experience to date. So giving those of you who are still in undergrad a view or perspective on one of many potential paths you can take to get into the industry. Find your passion, pursue it, anything, live your dream, what have you. And secondly, I'm going to give a little bit of a primer on the role of an ISO RTO, specifically through a markets lens, and also a little bit about how those markets are regulated, specific to PJM. I do need to give the caveat that I do not and cannot speak for PJM in this capacity. I'm just giving you educational information for folks who are equally as excited and passionate about this kind of work as I am. So without further ado, first and foremost, how did I get here? So my first exposure to energy as a mechanical engineer was through a summer co-op that I did the summer after my sophomore year. I worked in Columbus, Ohio with a company called PlugSmart that does energy efficiency projects, working on buildings that are, schools, privately owned companies, manufacturing facilities, all sorts of use cases, all sorts of facilities, going into the building and performing what are called energy audits and looking at the way in which this building is using electricity, gas, other sorts of fuels, and how that building can upgrade its processes to better serve those who are within the building, so improve the quality of life within, as well as to save energy, save money, and conserve some of what has become a precious resource. So after my experience there, which had, I will add, an interesting state policy exposure, because a lot of the projects that we worked on that had to do with public schools were sponsored and created as the result of a House bill at the time. So I can't recall the House bill number, but it was a House bill that prompted the release of funds at the state level to public schools so that they could use money from that pool to fund energy upgrades. So not only serving the students, but investing in something that would pay off over the lifespan of the project. So that was my first policy exposure in that first role in the energy field. And that was a really valuable experience for me. That exposure inspired a love and a very strong interest right off the bat. I carried that with me into my next summer term, which was with the WISE program, which is a group, kind of a consortium in DC. A number of engineering professional societies get together, and they each summer will sponsor one student from within their professional society to come to DC and do what kind of shadowing technical policy people. So do what they do, see what they see, tour a bunch of administrations, expose themselves to what policy work looks like on the ground, and also to engage in technical research. My technical research that summer had to do with wind turbine siting policies, and through that research specifically, I was exposed to a concept that is not readily apparent to folks who are new in energy necessarily, folks who are either coming in as enthusiasts for clean energy, folks who are interested in the engineering, maybe not from a power systems perspective, but it's the concept of an RTO. So the acronym RTO stuck with me after my tenure at the WISE program. And I spent my senior year, first and foremost, expanding on my technical research paper into a thesis. And second of all, spending most of my free time looking at jobs and looking at programs and trying to explore the industry and understand what kinds of roles were out there. And so I had held on to that acronym in my head, and one of the organizations that caught my eye was PJM. So PJM is an RTO, and I'm going to get into a little bit more about what that means in the coming slides, but they had a really interesting role in a rotational program that they were offering for students that would give you exposure to all sorts of functions within sort of the numerous things that an RTO can do. So this was the job that I applied for. It was my dream job at the time. It was the job that I am working in now. And this is what I'm here to talk to you about in boots on the ground. What is an RTO? And I've been working at PJM since graduation. I started in June of 2018. So what is PJM? PJM, like I mentioned, is an RTO. So an ISO RTO, there are 6 RTOs in the United States. And what you need to know first and foremost is that the United States is part of North America, and North America is comprised of 3 major interconnections. An interconnection is sort of a territory in which the transmission grid is connected. And so in the Eastern Interconnection, there are a number of balancing authorities and other kind of layers of jurisdiction and functional role. It gets very complicated, but what the RTOs do, RTOs are entities that run coordinated markets and planned transmission. PJM is one of 6 RTOs in the United States. The concept of an RTO began in the 1990s. This is when, at the federal level, competition was introduced per federal policy. The spirit of this policy was to introduce competition into the generation and transmission spaces. So generation and transmission had to be deregulated and divorced so that generation and transmission assets in these jurisdictional areas could not be owned by a singular company and have a monopoly in that sense. The vertical integration was broken there. And so what RTOs do, how they function, because of this deregulation, they were given a number of responsibilities for running a coordinating function now that those generation and transmission assets were divorced and not being operated under the same vertical integrated organization. the number one and the one that I'm going to talk about today is organized markets. And I will note as well, I'm going to get into the regulation later on in the presentation, but the federal entity that deals with most of these concepts and most of these functional roles is called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or the FERC. So PJM in form. PJM is an RTO, and we serve about 65 million people in our footprint. Our footprint is pictured here on the slide. We serve 13 states and the District of Columbia. I'm providing some stats on the slide for you here. It's a lot of numbers, but the key ones I'm going to highlight again later. You'll see this information come back up. But what I'm trying to show here is the scale. The scale was one of the things that really drew me to the company in the first place. It's a lot of service, serving a lot of load by volume, but also serving a lot of customers. The fact that there are 13 states within the footprint introduces a lot of regulatory questions, introduces complexities that maybe a single state ISO or RTO like New York or California don't have to deal with necessarily. So here are some of the basic stats. Now in function, I had mentioned markets previously, but there are three true functions that PJM is meant to serve. We consider these the pillars of what we do day to day, the prerogatives we are given in the creation, what we do to serve our members. These three things are, first and foremost, we are tasked with planning the transmission grid. So we execute long-term planning studies in order to understand what needs to be built in the near and far future in order to sustain reliability on the transmission grid. So based on our projections of load, our projections of generation that's coming online, based on our future forward look, what is going to need to come online in terms of transmission infrastructure to serve load ultimately and to maintain a reliable grid. Secondly is the markets, and I'd mentioned those before, but the markets exist in order to provide that coordinating function financially. And so when customers are consuming load and affording those, requesting those megawatts, so to speak, generators are generating. And you have a complex problem that arises when a number of loads and a vast number of generators are both requesting and sending megawatts. How do you price those? If the generators are diverse, if the generators are located in different places on the grid, the matrix of possibilities for prices to be set becomes very, very large. And so who is able to consume all of that information and generate prices at different points in the system? An RTO is one entity that can do that. And truly, I should have said this is the primary role of an RTO, and this is one of the functions that PJM holds close to its heart, is the day-to-day operations. So beyond the pricing and beyond the long-term planning is the moment-to-moment operation of the grid, looking at grid stability and looking at what generators need to turn on and turn off, and what do they need to do in order to keep the lights on, essentially. The photo on the screen is actually a picture of the PJM control room. So it looks like a number of complex diagrams, complex monitors that are looking at many, many metrics, looking at many, many plants, statuses, things like that, trying to understand the current state. So you look at this massive wall and you try to say, where are we now? What do we need? Where are we going to be in the next 5 minutes? So it's a very, very serious role that we take seriously, and it's something not to be overlooked when you consider these three functions. So my role at PJM, I'd mentioned this previously, the opportunity that I applied for when I was leaving school was for a role in what is called the PJM ARC program. The PJM ARC program is one of the rotational programs that you may be familiar with if you're an engineer applying for graduate degrees, or if you have ever been exposed to something along the lines of the leadership development program. It is designed to bring in early career engineers send them through departments in each of these 3 core functions, educate them, expose them to diverse projects, expose them to diverse concepts, and land them in a full-time role where they have a cross-divisional knowledge that's strong, they have analytic strength, and they can be very effective in looking at the broad swath of what PJM does and helping to improve what we do every day. So that's some of my role. That's my journey. That's a little bit about PJM. And now more so the focus of what I wanted to share is on specifically the electricity markets. So this caveat, we're focusing on the wholesale level, we're focusing at the RTO level, and this is going to be a very PJM-centric walkthrough. There are deregulated markets to look into. There is the retail side that offers its own complexities. There are many, many other ways to cut this and many, many other ways that you can look at how you get the prices you get for the electricity that you're paying for. So PJM Inform, you'd seen this slide previously, but in order to talk about markets and regulation, I want to focus on 2 of the metrics specifically. So first and foremost, the number of people served and the number of states served. So looking at the people, if you consider all of the consumers, and the consumer comes first in a sense, when we talk about reliability and putting reliability first, we are talking about making sure that consumers can get the electricity they need. So in order to serve these people, we need to be able to price the electricity that they get. And pricing that electricity is a function that exists on our side of the grid, so to speak, so not on the distribution system, but on the wholesale and the transmission side of the operation, because the generator question is so complex. Who needs to come online in the next hour? Who needs to come online tomorrow? What are the costs that each of these generators are generating, so to speak, when they turn on? There are a multitude of parameters that you need to optimize for, and it gets very complicated very quickly, as you'll see. And so this diagram is kind of speaking a little bit to the wholesale retail divide. PJM, you'd say, was everything from the middle of the diagram to the left. So running that operation, speaking to generators, deciding which generators to come on in an economic dispatch, and then settling with resellers who serve load in turn on the retail side. This is also a key area where competition is involved, and the idea of competition is key. Questions like who can generate, who do customers buy from? These are really key questions that you ask and that have been asked throughout the history of the industry that are fundamental to where we are today. And we'll take you on a journey if you track them back and ask them yourself. This is another quick diagram showing a little bit more about what it means when we say markets. So pricing electricity, I'm being very general when I say that. There are a number of components that exist within the electricity price, even just at the wholesale level. So you're talking about considering the real time, you're talking about moment to moment, who needs to come online. You're talking about who needs a day's notice, right? Because you can't just turn a CT, a combustion turbine plant, on or off. You need to give them notice ahead of time. So there are physical limitations essentially to whether you can turn a plant on or off that you need to account for in the way that you design the markets, so to speak. And so we have a real-time market and a day-ahead market, and these two work in tandem to ensure that generators are paid equitably for the needs of the system and are able to come online and perform in the manner that we need them to perform in order to serve the load. There are also a number of other sort of additional markets that you can consider. There's the long-term capacity market, which is very critical in terms of capacity performance, looking at reliability in the long term, and looking at generators that have not been built or come online yet, and how you can ensure that they have the necessary rate of return to build and to maintain themselves as a whole. What is the value of the capacity that they're providing to the grid? You have things like the long-term FTR market, which is related to transmission and congestion, and you have things like ancillary services, which become very important when you start talking about batteries and you start talking about more nuanced grid services that are really on the cutting edge of the new kinds of generation that we're seeing come into the market. And this is just a brief bar chart showing the changes in wholesale rate prices in PJM over time. So we're looking at 2014 to 2018. The green bar is retail rates, and of these retail rates, the wholesale component is called out in blue. So the wholesale component, you'll see in this little caveat here, the wholesale component is comprised of LMP, which is those two, the real time and the day ahead market, capacity, which is the long-term pricing that I'd mentioned, transmission, which has to do with congestion, but also has to do with building of transmission, and then a number of other costs that come up as you walk through the markets and as you plan and run the system. So back to PJM Inform. The other item on that table that I wanted to call out was the regulation piece. And the regulation piece is interesting when you start talking about the 13 states in DC that PJM serves. When you generate a megawatt and you use it to serve load, how do you track each of the electrons that leave a generator, enter onto the transmission system, and are sent down the line to serve that load? That's not really something that is physically feasible. You cannot account for electrons, and because of that, you have a lot of interesting and unique concerns that come up from a regulatory and a market perspective. You have interstate commerce. If the lines of your transmission system cross state borders, that triggers immediately the necessity, for federal oversight in that sense. And this is where the FERC comes in. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was one of the entities that came up in that time period. I mentioned the history of PJM is very closely tied to FERC and the directives that it brought forth, and the rulings and the acts that it was created by. FERC is an entity that operates in conjunction with the Department of Energy. In a sense, it is its own body. It has commissioners who are appointed by the executive branch and who are confirmed by Congress. You think about the federal level comprised of FERC. FERC regulates us entirely. FERC tells us what to do. But states are a different matter. When we talk about states and regulation and how state regulation exists in PJM, you can talk about state legislatures. So each of our 13 states has a legislature that issues laws, orders, directives, what have you. And those directives will either direct policy, direct funds, or influence the actions of the commissions that exist to support public utilities. And then there are the public utility commissions themselves. They come in a number of different forms. The names will change from state to state, but their function essentially is to be the regulator, not necessarily the legislator or the lawmaker, but to regulate in the day-to-day, say, different public utilities, not just electricity, in some cases, public services that need to be managed at a state level. So in some cases, electricity and transmission, especially at the retail level, retail rate cases are seen by public utility commissions. They oversee the execution of directives that are given by the state legislature. They have very, very critical roles in a lot of cases. And those two bodies are key to understanding the way in which RTOs interface with state regulation. And once we're on regulation at the federal and state level, I mentioned this, but really to assert the fact that FERC regulates PJM because we are an entity that operates across a territory, across a footprint, and because the transmission system is physically the way that it is. Something that is done in one location on the system will impact the entire system, so to speak. Whether that impact is minimal or not depends on the change, but changes to the market rules, changes to policies regarding transmission, changes to policies regarding generation. Those policies in one state can impact the entire transmission footprint in PJM. And that is where FERC comes in. FERC will regulate those. They approve market rule changes. They incite market rule changes if they deem something is necessary to be put into place. They also hear complaints and can issue fines. They have a lot of different acts that they can perform, and they do all of these roles for PJM and for the other RTOs to which they are jurisdictional. The states, on the other hand, do not regulate PJM. The states have a little bit more of a give and take in the sense that PJM's actions will influence wholesale prices, which influence the rates that the customers in states will pay. States will change policy or change regulations, and that will influence the way that members, generation owners, transmission owners of PJM will see and react to PJM's rules. So there is kind of a back and forth in that sense. The role that PJM plays for the states, we seek to educate and communicate technical concepts with them. If they have questions, we are at their service. We provide information to them. PJM can be called on to execute studies for state commissions. And states are members of the RTO by choice. That's also an interesting caveat. They can enter and exit RTOs at will, but because of the way that the federal regulations are set up, they do need in some way, shape, or form to fulfill obligations to customers. And so whether that is through being a member of an RTO and facilitating service of their customers in that way, or maintaining a transmission system entirely in their own state and owning that generation and serving their customers that way, those are two options, two of several, and the states have that power there. And so at a high level, those are the two classes of regulation you can think of when you think of PJM and market regulation. There is a wealth of information out there. You can look at any of PJM's public resources online. They have great state infrastructure reports that will give you information about what's going on in each of the states. They have published testimonies to commissions that will give you information about what PJM will do or share with commissions when they make requests. You can look at IEEE, which is an incredible technical resource for folks who are interested in power systems, both at the energy market theory and the raw transmission power. So questions of what are these new technologies, what's being done on the system, you can answer that by looking into these professional societies. FERC also has a lot of great documents out there that you can read through. You can read through the rules, you can read through thick reports, but they do a great job in working to educate folks who are interested. And they also, when they pose rulemakings, it is somewhat of a legal proceeding in the sense that entities can then pose comments back to rulings that FERC will make. And those are key and very important to coming to an understanding of what sense the industry has and what responses exist to changes in rules, changes in policies, or decisions that are put down from the federal regulator. And also outreach to industry professionals. This is a great way of staying connected and learning more. You can obviously reach out to any of us, as Katie had mentioned, and I appreciate your time. Thank you for being here today.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much for that, Madalyn. That was awesome. Up next, we'll have my teammate, Patricia D'Costa from ICF. Patricia is a senior consultant on the distributed grid strategy team. So please join me in welcoming Patricia. Looks like Patricia may be having a little bit of a connection issue here. We'll give her a couple more seconds. All right, sorry about that, folks. Patricia said she apparently can't turn on her video or audio, so she is going to go ahead and try and rejoin the session right now, and we should be on our way in just a few moments. All right, Patricia is going to go ahead and try and call in here real quick. And once she is able to call in, we should be able to at least hear her presentation, even though we might not be able to see her.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Patricia.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. I don't know what happened with my Zoom. So apologies, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'll keep trying to turn the video on, but not letting me. Okay, so yes, as Katie mentioned, we work together at ICF. I'm a senior consultant in the distributed grid strategy practice. So next, I don't know if I can move the slides, Katie.
Okay.
Or Jen. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'll start by talking about my personal path. So in terms of education, I started by an undergrad on industrial engineering, and then I did a master's in energy systems engineering. And in terms of work experience, I started doing some marketing with a large consumer product goods company, and then in IT at SAP. And then I moved into more of the clean tech world. So while I was doing my master's in energy system, that's when I shifted my career and started focusing on energy. So I work at a clean tech startup as a co-op while doing my master's. And then after I graduated, I went to work at an electric utility doing energy efficiency program implementation for electricity and gas. And then from there, I moved into consulting at energy consulting now at ICF, where I've been for 4 years. And my role, I'll talk more about that and what we do, but it's basically building on the energy efficiency experience and the many more distributed energy resources that continue to emerge. And they're just personally, so I started my undergrad in Venezuela, which is where I'm from, and then I moved to the US to do my master's. So all my clean energy experience is from the US. And I just wanted to show that because maybe there are some international students that are joining us today, or also to show that you can maybe do a master's to change careers or focus more into a specific subject. Okay, next, please. Okay, there. So about ICF. ICF is a publicly traded company with global presence in 65 offices worldwide. It's headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area. It has about 7,000 employees and $1.4 billion in revenue. And we work in consulting in many areas. as you can see, and our focus is in the energy practice, which of course it can be related to the environmental and transportation areas, as we'll see later. Next. So within ICF energy practice, we cover many areas. As you can see here in the logos, we have power markets, so a lot of related to what Madalyn was talking about of RTOs and organized markets. We have even fuel, natural gas, independent engineering for generation, power plants. We have a demand-side management program implementation for utilities. We had a advisory implementation for climate change and resilience, transportation, and beneficial electrification. But our practice, it's on the distributed grid strategy, and I'll go in more detail about what that looks like and the type of challenges that we work with utilities to solve. So the distributed grid strategy, Madalyn was talking before about generation and transmission resources. You'll see in the left of this graphic, but I'm going to talk on the right of this graphic, the distribution and consumption of electricity and energy. So we know that customers are adopting new technologies, distributed energy resources, or DERs. So it's changing the way we use electricity, and this has a lot of implications for electric utilities in terms of planning, because the way the grid was designed over 100 years ago when they put the poles was just one-way power flow. And now we have these distributed resources that may go both ways, like solar when they're trying to export back to the grid. So this means that utilities need to start planning for that, and in terms of what new tools and resources they're gonna need, and also what does the operations on the day-to-day look like, and the markets. So it's kind of a micro level, a down level of the same issues that we saw before in terms of the RTO, but a distribution. So yeah, as I said, this new distributed future is going to represent new challenges and opportunities for the electric network. So not just for utilities, also for third parties, and even can go all the way up to the RTO level. Yeah, so just to level set, when I talk about distributed energy resources, or DERs, are resources located at the electric distribution network, so either behind the meter or in front of the meter, but at the lower voltage distribution level. And it can include energy efficiency, demand response, solar photovoltaics, combined heat and power, CHP, diesel, even though it's not clean, but it does exist, battery storage, geothermal, wind, less so in the distribution, but there is some, and electric vehicles and fuel cells. So there are a couple of drivers for DER growth. So we have better performance, declining costs, preference from customers, enhanced grid services, and policy. So I chose to, because this panel is about clean energy policy, we're going to focus there on the type of policies related to these DERs or the distribution level. So why these policies, why regulators decide to enact these policies is just to empower more customer choice. So here we have an example of a typical house and the different type of distributed energy resources, DERs, that customer can deploy and the different reasons. So, you know, they can have solar to meet sustainability goals or even to decrease their bill rates. They can choose to be part of an appliance recycling or new appliance rebate program from the utilities. They can choose to be part of a rate that changes by time, so time of use rates, and be part of a demand response programs. So, for example, if you have a smart thermostat like on Google Nest, you can automate that the utility can choose to turn on and off at certain times of day, and the customers can look at saving into their bills. And then also, of course, the point of those programs is that the utility and overall customers would also save, as well as the environmental benefits. And, oops, can we go back? Sorry, I don't know why they're changing. Okay, so yeah, and more, I think newer DERs are, customers are now purchasing more electric vehicles, either because they like the new technology or they're also looking to save money. There's also home energy management tools, either for security or just for convenience. You can control a lot of energy appliances from your mobile devices. And in some states, we've seen hurricanes or fires that have had a lot of issues with electric utilities power outages. So resilience and batteries can be very important in certain places. So here we have a summary of the clean energy policy evolution. So it started with a production tax credit, PTC, and the investment tax credit, ITC. So that supported a lot of deployment for solar and wind, and still does. And this is the only example of policy at the federal level that we're gonna see here. But this has had and continues to have a lot of implications of growth. And that eventually evolved into net energy metering. So net energy metering is about the customers who have solar or distributed generation on site, and they want to export the remaining of the energy they're not using back to the grid, and they want to get paid. So initially, net energy metering, customers will get paid equally back of what they were paying per kilowatt. But now that has evolved into conversation of the real value of solar or value of DER, which is trying to figure out what's the actual locational and temporal value of resources, and not just trying to pay equal, because and this is something Madalyn also touched about, like resources have, the pricing of the resources is dependent of the location and the time they can provide services. And it shouldn't necessarily be equal everywhere. So that's the evolution in terms of paying like rates for distributed energy resources. Then in terms of planning, so I think it started with integrated resource planning, IRPs. Madalyn started talking about how RTOs plan for generation and transmission for their regions. But then in states that are still vertically integrated, the utilities have to plan for the resources. So they develop integrated resource plans, IRPs, and this was a policy that states started to enact just to guarantee the long-term security, reliability of both supply, but also the cost for customers could be stable. And that has more recently evolved also IRP practices now into the distribution resource plans. So instead of at the macro level, big power plant generations, some states have started to be more curious about what goes on into the distribution level planning. So, if we have states that have been deploying a lot of DERs, or what would be the impacts for the distribution system? And that's also coupled with some grid modernization plans. So a lot of the infrastructure that was deployed over 100 years ago, now it's aging, and it either has to be replaced because of basic reliability or just because of these new needs with all the new distributed energy resources deployed. There's a need for more monitoring, control, and visibility of these resources. And then that is now evolving into something called integrated distribution system planning. And those are like the most evolved states that are looking into how to integrate these both types of planning practices. So IRP at the wholesale generation level with distributed resource plans. And then you might be also familiar with the other state level policy, which is energy efficiency portfolio standards and renewable portfolio standards. And that's basically states setting these targets to meet certain levels. So it's, for example, 40% solar or renewable energy by 2030. So those policies were enacted a couple of years ago, decades, and some states renewed those and extended them. And then we also have states that started having, instead of broader renewable energy policies, they started to be more specific and say out of those renewable targets, you have to meet certain percentage from solar. And then we have some states that therefore that develop solar markets with renewable certificates. And then from the energy efficiency portfolio standards, that's where we see all the energy efficiency programs that the utilities manage. You might be familiar or have participated in this. And this is a big part of what ICF does as well from the program implementation side of things. And then now you might have seen many states are evolving that into just 100% clean or renewable energy net zero goals. 1 second, I have a couple of questions here. Okay, what would I say is the biggest driver for a utility to incentivize DER adoption for customers? Yes?
Patricia, we'll answer all questions at the end of the session, so
Great.
You can continue.
Great, I was trying to multitask. Thanks. Okay, can see the arrows. Okay, so I'll try to be brief, and you guys can go back to this if you want to. I just wanted to give some snapshot of what's going on in some of the DER policies out there. So for distributed solar, you can see the map. It's pretty active. Most states have some level of distributed solar policy, and here are the type of examples. So it could be net metering rules, what I was talking about, compensation for exporting solar or any generation back into the system. So certain states decided to put caps on it, or caps of system sizes, aggregation rules, and different compensation rates. There's some states that allow community or virtual net metering for solar. As I said, there's states looking into the value of solar and cost benefits analysis. There are some states that adopted solar charges for interconnection or monthly fixed charges or demand charges. And there's also some nuances about solar ownership. So this changes by each state. So there's third-party leasing or power purchase agreement or utility-led rooftop solar programs. And I included the source of these if you want to have more details of the information and regulations behind this map. Then next on energy, okay. On energy storage, this is moving by itself. Okay, energy storage landscape, that's more new, and it tends to follow states with high deployment of solar PV. We have a couple of states that have enacted energy storage targets like California, Oregon, New York, Nevada, Massachusetts, Hawaii, and Virginia more recently. So they basically said we want these many thousand or hundreds megawatts of energy storage deployed in the grid, either at wholesale level or distributed level by this year. And this is all with the intent to integrate more renewable energy into the grid, of course. So there's other states that are starting by having some studies and investigations, and even looking into how storage can fit into IRP. There's other states that are more evolved and are already looking at compensation rules or have some tax incentives, rebates and grants, and even include energy storage in demand response programs from utilities. And then other type, lastly, some interconnection rules for energy storage. Then in terms of electric vehicles, you'll see the map, it looks active, but it's because this includes any type of electric vehicle policy, which can be just basically a rebate that can come from at the state level or the utility. Then there are some utilities that are already offering charging rates, options, or make ready infrastructure. So preparing the electric distribution grid for third parties to put a charging station and just manage it. And then like a Tesla, for example. And then conversations about third-party roles, because this can get convoluted in terms of what determines a utility. So some states are looking into those details. If this, like Tesla, who manage the charging station, is allowed to sell electricity, and if so, would that constitute a regulated utility, basically? And then the regulator in that state would start to look at the rates, at the charging rate that they offer customers, because that's basically the role of the regulator at the state level, is to make sure that the cost of electricity for customers remains stable. And that's why utilities are monopolies, because they have the purview of the regulator for that. And then, as I was speaking, we have the IRP and now the distribution system planning. So some of these states are already taking steps into making this process, which of course has always existed, but now there's like new methodologies that and practices that utilities have to integrate, just so they can include more DERs into the system. And also it's becoming more of a public and transparent process, because there's many more stakeholders and third-party providers that are interested on making sure this process advances in support of more renewables integration. So we have new policies about forecasting DER. So these are practices within distribution system planning, hosting capacity analysis, which looks into how much capacity does the distribution system have to integrate solar or other generation at the distribution level. So that therefore, if you are a solar developer, you can use this hosting capacity analysis to look where a utility may have ability to interconnect a system. So you can look for prospective clients in an easier way. There's some policy about non-wires alternatives. This means using the DERs to meet a needs of the system instead of the traditional substation or distribution wires alternatives. There's also some policies about including pilots and demos of new technologies, and then also reliability and resilience assessment. As I mentioned earlier, resilience is becoming increasingly important, especially in certain states that continue to really leave the impacts of climate change. And then grid modernization and stakeholder engagement. As I say, there's this need for more transparency into the process. Next, okay. Yeah, so this is a similar map, but this looks into the grid modernization type of policies, which mainly started with the advanced metering infrastructure implementation. These are significantly large deployments. We're talking about millions of meters to be deployed. So this is billions of dollars in investments. So that's seen as a foundational investment for modernizing the grid because it's seen as a technology that enables the utilities to look more granularly at the usage of electricity from customers, which enables them also to offer time of use rates that are more reflective of the way people consume energy and therefore try to offer more targeted and tailored solutions to save energy. And also there's other operational benefits that some utilities have actually justified. Then we have seen some of these states also request utilities to file grid modernization plans. So every utility that is regulated, so all the investor-owned utilities that are monopolies are regulated by the state regulator, and they have to file rate cases, which is a request to increase rates, and they have to justify why and see the plans for the infrastructure. So we've seen some of these states have come up with grid modernization requirements for plans to just give more details into what they have requested in their rate cases. As I said, another type of policy is implementing time-barrier rates because it seems as a benefit of implementing AMI. There's some regulations coming up about data access for customers or third parties. So, also related to AMI, what are utilities doing with that data and who can access it and why and when. And as well, lastly, is performance-based rate making. It's another type of policy. So regulators are trying to link the rate of return that utilities are allowed based on some metrics, like, for example, in some cases, DER interconnection, customer satisfaction, and many others related to renewable and clean energy integration. So yeah, all of this basically explains that the utilities roles are expanding. So the basic traditional roles of the utilities and will remain like that forever is maintain reliability, safety, security, and resilience, which was sort of implicit, the last one, resilience, but now it's becoming very explicit. Resilience is very important now for the utilities, and that there's other roles on the bottom here, which are all related to DER integration. So enable market participation. So what I was talking about, net metering and the evolution of rate compensations based on the DER resources. So facilitating interconnection of DERs, proactive integration, maximizing the values of the programs, or as I was talking, non-wires alternatives, so non-traditional alternative to distribution system needs. And so, yeah, as I said, this brings a lot of opportunities into planning, operation, and business models for utilities. So in terms of planning, utilities need to think about new capabilities and grid investments to support the DER integration and utilization and to achieve these new sustainability goals that state regulators are setting for them. And in terms of operations, there's the need for better visibility of the system and remote control to maintain the safety and reliability that is needed. And in terms of the business model, so there's this need to make sure that there's a balance and the utilities can continue to be financially stable. At the same time, they allow for DER integration, so third-party, basically competitors, to come in and support renewable integration, but still maintaining the financial health of the utilities because they continue to provide these really important infrastructure, so the cables to flow that electricity to the customers. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Katie, for the invitation, and I apologize for the technical inconvenience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Patricia. That was awesome. So with that, we will move on to our final speaker before the Q&A session. Up next, we have Katie Rever, who is the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs at IGS Energy. And we are so excited to have Katie here with us today. So welcome.
Great. Thank you, Katie. Thank you for the introduction, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and for joining us and sticking with us through until the 8 o'clock hour. It's great to be here. So I work for a company called IGS Solar. We're based in Dublin, Ohio. I've been in the clean energy space for over a decade. I've been in solar for over a decade. And it's really been an interesting and winding route to get here. And you know, today's presentation is pretty short to go over solar policy in the U.S. I think Patricia did a really good job, and Maddie also with the RTO overview. But there's a lot of different policies that are being discussed now in the clean energy space and just in the electricity industry in general. And anytime that there's a lot of conversation and a lot of change, there are good careers to be had. So I think that you all that are thinking about how to enter this field at this point in time, it's ripe for a lot of work. So it's a good time to be doing it. All right, I am going to try to there we go. All right. So I'll start off with a little bit of an overview of my career path, and then I'll get into a little bit about IGS and then some more into the solar policy in the US. Again, you know, there's a lot to cover in 15 to 20 minutes, so I really just hope to give you a very high overview of the solar industry here in the US. So I had a pretty winding route to energy policy. I started off in, my undergraduate degree was from the University of Virginia in biology. And while I loved biology, I loved the sciences, but I realized through lab work and through field work that I didn't actually want to be a producer of the science. I more wanted to be a consumer and implementer of the science that other people produced. So after undergraduate, I volunteered for a few years teaching middle school students primarily in various capacities. And then I went back to graduate school. I have a master's of environmental management and a master's of public policy from Duke University. Through the teaching and into graduate school, I really came to understand that it's how humans interact with the environment that I was really interested in engaging in. And in graduate school, as I started to study energy policy more, how humans generate and use electricity has an enormous impact on our environment. And so that's how I came into doing energy policy. In graduate school, I would say that the skills that I really honed and I think are really critical for this type of work, really good writing skills, critical thinking and analysis skills, and the ability to be a good consumer of statistics, not necessarily producing it all the time by yourself, but being a very good consumer of statistics. And then on the job, I think that, in addition to a lot of the content specific information, I continue to hone the skills that I learned in policy school, but then also added public speaking, how to negotiate with various parties and how to drive consensus amongst different points of view and different business models or different business interests, how to develop relationships with high-level government officials, and how to communicate concisely with fast-paced individuals. or fast-paced people in the business world. I think in the policy world, it can get pretty wonky, and we like to get into a lot of details. But when you're working for a company, you need to be able to translate all of that wonkiness into clear and concise bits of information that the people who are running the business and making business decisions can use as they're going out and doing that. So after graduate school, I started out as a presidential management fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy in the solar program there. I really got a 50,000-foot view of the solar industry, of the technology, of the markets. And then from DOE, I went to the Solar Energy Industries Association, where I led policy initiatives at the state level, spent about 4 or 5 years there, and then joined IGS to do legislative and regulatory affairs for the solar business with IGS. A little bit about IGS. Where IGS is a little over 30 years old, based in Dublin, Ohio. The company started when Ohio deregulated the natural gas industry and was really focusing on C&I customers, or commercial and industrial customers, serving natural gas to commercial and industrial customers. They've evolved since then to add electricity. So they're a retail supplier now for electricity and natural gas for both commercial customers as well as residential customers. And then in the last few years, they've diversified even more and have really focused on seeing distributed generation as a big future for the company, and solar in particular. And we just launched a new commitment to green energy, which is really exciting. So I'm on the regulatory team at IGS, but I support the solar business. And so I work with state legislatures and regulatory bodies across the US on policies that are important to IGS. So, and at IGS, I see my job as as two sides of the same coin. On one side, I am advocating for the interests of IGS with these policymaking bodies and participating in the conversations and trying to drive them in ways that will facilitate business. And then on the opposite side of that coin, I help our business leaders and business folks to understand the changing policy landscape and how that impacts the business so that they can make business decisions in this changing policy world. So getting into the meat of the policy aspects, again, this is, you've seen similar slides from the previous presenters. We're really moving from the centralized utility grid that has been the norm for the last 100 years, central station power generation, one-way power flow from the centralized generation out to the consumers. And through cost declines in technology and in communications and increased consumer demand for various things, we're moving into more of a two-way power flow system where there's a lot of intelligence at the nodes. And so we're in the middle of this transformation right now. This is really the work of this last decade and the next couple decades to transform not only the technology, but also the market rules and the regulations and the business models. So it's there's, as you saw from from Patricia's presentation, there are a lot of policy conversations and a lot of big questions that are being discussed around the country. So a little bit about solar and why it's growing so much. There's been huge cost declines in the technology. This is a graph that shows dramatic declines in the cost of solar modules over the last decade, coupled with the dramatic increases in global module production. So this economies of both the improvements in solar technologies and economies of scale have really driven costs down globally. And to put the US market into global context, so this is the, there were about 115 gigawatts of photovoltaics or solar technology deployed in around the world last year. The US was 10 to 15% of that market. Europe was about just under 20%. Europe had been a leader throughout the 2010s. Europe really was a main leader. Europe and Japan were really big global leaders. And now China and Asia are kind of leading the pack with regards to deploying the technology. The US is a really strong market. And, you know, I put this snapshot up there really to show that solar is here to stay. It's here to stay in the US and it's here to stay globally. It's a pretty, from being in the industry from, you know, 2010 on, it's really a wonderful thing to see the growth and the explosion of solar around the world. So moving on, there are three main market segments that we think about when we talk about the deployment of solar technology. They all have they're different size systems with different types of off-takers, and they interact with the distribution system or the transmission system in different ways, and there are different policies that drive all of these different market segments. So you've got small systems that are on residential homes. You've got medium-sized systems that are on commercial buildings, schools, churches, those types of off-takers. And then you have utility scale. This utility scale system on the right is probably a 10 megawatt system that is with a municipal utility. Right now in the world, there are 100 megawatt systems up to 500 megawatt systems that are going in. So this utility scale system is a small utility scale system for the market. And IGS really focuses on the residential and the non-residential or the commercial systems. The graph here on the left shows the rise in the solar installations in the US throughout the last decade. There is the utility scale segment is the largest in terms of the number of megawatts deployed every year, but the residential market is the largest in terms of the number of systems, which entirely makes sense. The pie chart on the right shows the distribution of the solar that was deployed in 2018 around the US. And these markets are really driven by state policies. It's really, as Patricia mentioned, there is some federal policy, but electricity markets are governed by state bodies, and that's really what drives it. And it's also spread throughout the US, as you can see. Another, putting solar in context. So solar in the US is still a small fraction of overall generation. It's about 2.5% to 3% of overall generation, but it's a significant part of new generation. So about 40-ish% of new capacity that's going in is solar. So it's catching up. And there are, again, Patricia covered a lot of these policy drivers for distributed generation. At the federal level, it's the investment tax credit. At the state level, net metering, or how is solar compensated? What is the value of the electrons that are being sent out to the grid? there's renewable portfolio standards and incentive programs to drive. There are interconnection policies, or how are the utilities enabling or allowing all of these systems to interconnect and interact with their distribution system. Permitting is really at the local level. And then building and electrical codes are also really important. And all of these different policies, when I work on these different policies at the state level, sometimes it's legislative. The route to addressing the policy is via legislative body, and sometimes it's via a regulatory body. It really just changes depending on the state and depending on the situation. On this slide shows the policy priorities that we've had at IGS for 2020 and 2021, the various policies that I've been focusing on. So for example, in New Jersey, they are redesigning their incentive program. That's a policy conversation in front of the Board of Public Utilities. In Pennsylvania, we've been trying to push an expansion of the alternative energy portfolio standard, and that's a legislative push trying to get legislation changed. In Illinois, that's also a legislative push trying to get extended funding for the adjustable block program. And then at the federal level, I think an important policy is the extension of the investment tax credit with, particularly with, so right now the investment tax credit is stepping down every year, and it'll phase down to 10% in a couple of years. But with all of the economic slowdown around COVID, we are trying to get an extension of that phase down so that we can make up for some of the lost time that we had in the economic slowdown that we've had because of COVID. There's also the implementation of FERC Order 2222. This just came out, and this is talking about the aggregation of distributed generation in wholesale markets. So currently, the way that behind the meter or distributed generation, distributed solar is compensated is all at the retail level. But we're also would like to be able to participate in wholesale markets. You can't really have one home participate in a wholesale market, but the concept is if you can aggregate, call it maybe 1,000 homes, then you could start participating in wholesale markets and be able to provide benefit to those wholesale markets and get additional revenue for the projects on top of the retail revenue that's coming in. And so summing this up, this is also the desire of the NC State analysis that Patricia mentioned. This just shows the number of different policy actions. Again, the only thing constant in this world is change, and I think that means that, you know, if people want to be in this business, there are careers to be had, for sure. And then in my parting thoughts, my parting words, going back to the career aspect of it, some words that I have had, a quote that I had by Dale Carnegie that I have had posted to my my computer monitor for the last decade is: the best possible way to prepare for tomorrow is to concentrate with all your intelligence, all your enthusiasm on doing today's work superbly today. It can be, as you try to navigate the career world, it can be overwhelming and confusing and uncertain. And what I have found is by focusing on this, by doing my best job on what I'm doing today, that really sets me, that has really set me up and can really set you up for success in the future. And, you know, I firmly believe that luck is where preparation meets opportunity. And at all of the junctures in my career, from getting the job at DOE, and then to getting the SIA job. And for the SIA job, I had lunch with a former colleague, and mentioned that I was interested in finding something different. And he suggested, hey, why don't you look at this job? And I was able to get a really good recommendation from somebody that I had worked with at DOE that was well respected in the solar industry. So by doing the best work I could do at DOE and working really well with folks there, that set me up for the SIA job. And then the IGS position, I was just, walking. I met some IGS folks at a happy hour at a conference, and started talking with them about policy and how that could impact their business. And a couple of months later, I was working for IGS. So it's really these like happy coincidences, I think, where by being prepared and being out there and looking for opportunities, that's where the luck comes together. So, and with that, thank you.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much, Katie. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions here. So if we want to bring the panelists back down just for 1 or 2 of those, and then we'll go through the final portions of the session. So we had a few questions come in here today. The first one was, what would you recommend to a young professional who's been working post-grad, who's interested in transitioning to the clean energy sector? And this one is open to any of the panelists who spoke here today.
I think it's without knowing their background or knowing where the interests are. I think do informational interviews. Just connect with folks, do informational interviews, try to learn what people are doing. And through some of those informational interviews, you'll either get a better understanding of where you would like to go. And you might also, you never know, maybe they think of somebody who has a job opening. So I mean, that would be one of the places that I would start.
Oh, looks like we have Patricia back as well.
I know. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I can chime in on that one. I would say, yes, networking is very important, and don't feel a lot of pressure about it. Just try to be easy and just have interesting conversations. And, something can come up from just as Katie was saying, a policy conversation, and then you meet somebody that remembers you or can tell you about the name of a company that you had never heard of, but it turns out to be very interesting. That was actually what happened to me with ICF. I didn't know about this company, and somebody just mentioned it to me. And then when I look it up, I was like, wow, I love that kind of job. That will be perfect. And then you start maybe, subscribing to notifications about job openings, and then you apply. Or you can also reach out to people like us on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great tool. So just have informational interviews and ask people maybe from your university or other like networks or friends of friends, just to learn more about what they do and figure out if you like it or have new recommendations.
Yeah, I think these are all really great recommendations. I think the only other ones that I might add to that, it's got to be tricky if you're thinking about doing this in this kind of environment. Don't be afraid to talk on the phone with folks, offer to do some kind of like Zoom happy hour. I'm sure there are a lot of professional organizations that are doing digital meetups and networking that way. One other thing that could be interesting is if you are looking at technical papers or reports online and you see something that really catches your eye, don't be afraid to reach out. This might be kind of unique to academia, but I'm sure there are a lot of other spaces where there are people who are proud of the work that they do and they're excited about it. And so if you read their paper or see something that they put out and you have that similar sentiment, don't let that go unnoticed. That's an opportunity for you to ask questions, deepen your knowledge, and really engage with someone who might be an expert in that space.
Those are really good points. And I would say also, similar to Patricia, I heard about ICF because I just started telling people what I wanted to do. And every single time I said what I wanted to do, they mentioned ICF in response. And so I think it's really valuable, all of those responses. On a more technical level, we had several questions around policies on the federal level. And so several folks asked, what are some policies you would like to see implemented at the federal level? And then going off of that, how would you explain the importance of renewable energy policy to policymakers?
So I can start there. I mean, I think for IGS at the federal level right now, you know, as I mentioned, an extension of the investment tax credit. There's a lot of different conversations that can happen at the federal level, but the state level is really where electricity markets are regulated, at least retail electricity markets are regulated. So that there's a lot of rubber meets the road at the state level. It'll be, yeah, I think if, depending on what happens with the election this coming November, there could be more or less opportunities for federal policy. So, and then, you know, how do you explain the importance of renewable energy to a legislator? First, you have to understand what their interests are. And a lot of times policymakers are more interested in jobs, economic development, benefits to their constituents, benefits to low income constituents. So you have to kind of weave those stories into it when you're talking with policymakers.
That's great insight, Katie. We'll take one more question and then I'll wrap it up here. This one is specifically for Madalyn. Someone asked, can you speak to who the customers are of PJM and where the revenue comes from? Is there a cost to be a member of PJM, for example?
There is a cost to membership. This is a very interesting question because you may have stumped me on the specifics, but we have about 1,000 members, and a member can be anything from a consumer advocate group that represents the interests of load-serving entities or states who want to keep costs low for their customers and be an advocate in our stakeholder process. We have generation owners, we have transmission owners, so someone like a First Energy or an AEP or a Dayton Power and Light. We have financial players who don't own any physical assets in the system necessarily, but they do play, if you recall that kind of football shaped diagram, they play on the fringe of that. They don't play necessarily in generation or consumption, they play in hedging, they play in futures, but they have an interest in the way that the rules are set up because of that activity. So they invest in becoming members and they advocate for their interest in the stakeholder process in that way. So I kind of hit on, we have 5 core groups. And PJM has this very well laid out on the website, so there's a lot more detail that exists there. I would love to kind of go into more on that, but I don't want to hedge on the cost. RTOs are very, very complicated and very interesting, and I did not at all do it justice. Please check out the website. So thank you for the question.
Great. Awesome. Well, I think with that, we will go ahead and conclude. Thank you so much to all of our panelists here today and everybody who helped plan this event. So we do have 3 more sessions coming up over the next several days. Tomorrow we have a session from 6:30 to 8 p.m. Eastern time on clean energy and social impact, followed by 2 sessions on Saturday with our keynote speaker, Susan Brennan, who is the COO of Bloom Energy, and then a panel session on discovering your vocation within the clean energy field. At the conclusion of the session, you will be asked to fill out a survey. Please, please fill out that survey. We will be making a lot of decisions on that and how we move forward for next year, and potentially hosting other networking events for interested parties. We will also be sending follow-up materials, including the presentations from today's session, as well as the other sessions, contact information for all of the speakers. And then we do have some companies who are recruiting from the attendees of these conferences, including my company, ICF. So we will be sending some open available positions, as well as some contact information and how to apply for those positions as well. So thank you all, everyone, for joining tonight. We really hope you found this valuable, and we encourage you again to reach out to our speakers here today. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.